In this channel, we've already covered how to create a 3D card using After Effects, but this time we're doing it all in true 3D using Blender, a completely free and open source software. I'm gonna walk you through the building blocks of the entire geometry node setup, as well as the real-time portal effect, which was made possible by the Ray Portal node, meaning it's all done with a shader, so no compositing is required, and it's fully procedural. With that said, it would be good to have some basic understanding of how Blender and geometry nodes work in order to follow along more easily, but there aren't any complicated math equations involved, apart from the portal shader, which was only possible for me to figure out because I reached out to the Blender help subreddit, and a user by the name of B2Z3D helped me figure it out, so a huge thanks goes out to them. Originally, I was using a method that involved different view layers and compositing, which wasn't as straightforward as I couldn't see the final result before rendering, but this is a much more elegant solution and everything is a part of one view layer. For time management's sake, I won't be recreating the whole thing from scratch, but rather focus on the important pieces first and then speed through the repetitive tasks. We'll create the base shapes and outlines with some basic materials, then set up a node tree that allows us to control the roundness of each corner either together or individually. We'll then create text elements for the name, type, description, attack, health, and some holder shapes for the last two mentioned elements. Then we'll expose the values we need access to for easier control by plugging them into the group input, choosing specific value types that make sense, and limiting some of them to a minimum and maximum range, and finally renaming and organizing properties with panels. We'll then take a look at the portal shader and how the portal room was set up. In the end, we'll do a simple studio setup with an infinite backdrop and make use of the real-time compositor for some final touches. To follow along, you will need Blender 4.2 or newer, as the Ray Portal node is only available from that version onwards. If you want to skip the creation process, then you could also grab the template on my Gumroad page for a few bucks, and you'll be able to immediately jump in and tweak the values in order to create your own 3D card designs. But even then, I would encourage you to watch through the tutorial because not only is there valuable information about how everything was set up, but you'll also get a better idea on how you could potentially make changes to the template, take out or add new functionality, and so on. And now finally, let's jump in and get started. Alright, so here we are now in Blender 4.2. We'll start by adding in a new plane. This is just so we can add the geometry nodes modifier, and we'll call it 3D card. By the way, this mesh can be anything you want it to be. We just need a base. So let's switch over to the geometry nodes editor. We'll hit new, and we'll start with the base. So let's cut off the group input. Actually, we'll delete it for now. We don't need it. And let's say add in a quadrilateral. This is basically a rectangle, and we'll plug that into the geometry. And here we can set the width and the height. Maybe we'll do 2 by 3. So this is going to be the base. Now let's go ahead and add a fillet curve, which will allow us to round out the corners. But let's switch over to the poly mode. And this way we can add more subdivisions. So now we have a rounded corner instead. And also, if you don't want this result, you can just check limit radius, so it will clamp it. And remember to hold down Shift for finer control. Now let's turn this into mesh, and we'll start by adding a curve to mesh node, and make sure the fillet curve is plugged into the profile curve. And then we'll drag out from the curve, and we'll use a curve line node. And now if we just Control Shift left click on this node, it will link it to a viewer node just so we can preview what that looks like. And by the way, I think you have to enable the Node Wrangler add-on. So you can search for Node Wrangler and make sure that is enabled. And then you'll have some shortcuts when using nodes. And basically the curve line generates a line from point A to point B. And it's using vectors, so X, Y, and Z is the starting point, so everything is set to 0. And then we have the end point where the X and Y are set to 0 as well, so it doesn't go this way or that way, but it does go up. And basically the Z value in this case is the extrusion. So let me go back to the curve to mesh. And now what's happening is it's using this shape as a profile and then generating a 3D mesh from point A to point B based on the curve input. But then we can also check the fill caps to close the two sides there. And again, we can tweak the Z value to determine the depth amount. Think of this combo as a solidify modifier. Now, after the curve to mesh point, I like to add a transform geometry node just so we can have control over the position, rotation, and scale if we ever need it. And then finally, we'll do a set material node, which we can use to set a material. And right now we don't have any materials, so let's go ahead and create one. We'll do base, say make it kind of blue. And let's just first apply it over here. Now let me switch over to the material preview and let's say increase the metallic, maybe lower the roughness. Now we got some reflections, maybe darken this down a bit. And in fact, let me just switch to cycles. And over here we can uncheck scene world and scene lights. So now we're using this default HDRI. And now before we move on, let me just duplicate this transform geometry. We'll plug it after the set material and we'll just rotate it by 90 degrees on the x-axis, just so it's facing forward. And let me also bring up the world opacity. I think I'll just turn off the metallic and then we'll brighten up the base color. Now let's go ahead and create the node tree that allows us to control the beveling or the roundness of each corner individually. And what we want to do is use this radius value. Now the way we can determine in Blender which corner to bevel, because these are vertices at the end of the day, is by using the index node, because index refers to the number of the vertices. So let's say this vertex can be index 0, this one 1, and then 2 and 3, because they always start from 0, and I'll just delete these. So now if we click and drag this out and type in index, you can see that everything is being rounded except for that top corner. Now how do we get access to all the other vertices? Well, let's go ahead and add a compare node. And we'll switch this to an integer because index numbers are always round. You can't have decimals, whereas float supports decimal numbers as well. And we'll plug the index into the top socket, and then we'll do equal mode, and then we can determine which index we're targeting. So you got 0, 1, 2, 3. After this, we can add a math node, set it to multiply, and this will allow us to control the intensity of the roundness. But now, how can we make it so we can control the other ones as well? Well, first, let me set this back to 0, and then we'll go ahead and duplicate this 3 more times. And we'll plug the index into the top socket of each one. And by the way, you can hold down Shift and then right-click and drag, which will merge all of those into one point, just so it's a bit more clean. Then we'll go ahead and set the second one to 1, then we'll do 2, and then 3. And then we'll also duplicate the multiply, so we can control the intensity of those other ones as well. And then finally, we have to also add these together, and we'll do math node. We'll set it to add, and this is how we'll do it. So let's add the first one and the second one, then we'll duplicate it. We'll add this to the third, and then we'll duplicate it one more time. We'll add this one with the fourth. And now this last node contains the values of all 4 of these guys. And then we can just plug that into the radius. And now we can control the 0 index, we can control the second one, third, and fourth, all individually. Now, one final functionality I want to add is to be able to switch between controlling them all together with one value and then controlling them separately like we have here. And we do that with a switch node. First of all, let's switch this over to a float because these values are float values, so they can't contain decimals. And we'll plug the false into the false value and then output over to the fillet curve. So now we're going to use the switch, which is a Boolean. So this can be on or off. So in the case it is off, it's going to give us the false value into the output. But when we check it on, then it's going to give us the true value into the output. In this case, it's 0, but we can then increase this. So now this is the global value. And if we have this off, this is the added sum of these values. Now for the switch, let's just click and drag this out and we'll do a Boolean math node and we'll use the equal method. And then we'll check the bottom one. So now what we're saying is if the top one is equal to the Boolean, then output true. If not, output false. So right now it's outputting false because this top Boolean is not checked. Therefore, it's not equal to the bottom Boolean. But if we check it, the top one is equal to the bottom one, so it's outputting true, therefore giving us true, this value. So now we can effectively just determine whether we're using the false value or the true value just by checking or unchecking this box. All right, so hopefully that made sense. Now, all of these nodes make up the corner rounding logic. So let's just go ahead and group this by hitting Control G, and then you can hit Tab to go in and out of that node group. And this will allow us to keep everything tucked in nicely inside of node group, and then we can reuse this throughout the geometry nodes project. And we'll call this corners rounding, and then we can tab inside of it. And what I want to do inside of here is expose some of these values into the group input so we can then see them here. So we'll start by grabbing the true value from the switch node. You can then hit N to toggle this panel on the side, go over to group, and here you can rename these values. So let's do bevel amount. Then we'll drag the multiply values one by one on the separate corner bevels. And then we'll drag this top value over here. And then we'll call it linked corners. Actually, let me just bring it up top. And by the way, this is of type Boolean. Let me go back real quick with tab. Now we have that value visible to us. Now let me see which is which. Let me just toggle this off for the moment. So this one is the top right corner. This is top left. This is bottom left. And then this should be bottom right. So now we can start dragging these in and rename them. In fact, I like to go from left to right. So I'll just do top left, top right, bottom right. So now it goes like this. And then we'll just rename the output property to bevel amount. Now when we tab out of the group, we have all of those properties exposed, and we have the bevel amount going straight into the radius. Now we can check if we want to have linked corners, and then this value will control the roundness of all of them together. But if we have that set to off, then we can control them individually. And by the way, as I said before, you can use the shift right click to add these rerouting points, just in case you want to reorganize this and make it look a bit prettier, which I'll do right now. So you can see now this looks a lot cleaner. And in fact, I could have gone ahead and also toggled the grid snapping. So this would have even been like perfectly aligned horizontally and vertically. Now let's step back into the home canvas, we'll call it, and we'll bring back the group input. And you'll see over on the modifiers tab, as soon as we click and drag something into the group input, that will be exposed over here. So now you can have access to it from the modifiers panel and quickly control whatever you want. So let's go ahead, undo that, and we'll start doing this in order. So first of all, I want to click and drag the material. Then let's grab the width and the height. Then we'll drag the endpoint, but first let me just go ahead and hit combine X, Y, Z. And this will allow us to get the input of X, Y, and Z separately. So I just want to grab the Z and drag it over here. Now remember, we can bring up the right side panel by hitting N, and I want to rename this to depth instead, and this just controls the depth. Then we'll grab the translation from transform geometry and plug it in here, and I'll rename it to position because I think that's a bit easier for people to understand. Now I want to grab the count of the fillet curve. So remember, this sets the subdivisions. So we'll even call it corners bevel subdivisions. And we'll leave the type to integer because you can either have 1, 2, 3. You can't have 1.5 subdivisions. And then down here, you can see we have the minimum and maximum values. Minimum is 1, but let's set the maximum to 64 because we don't want people to go over this. And I think, oh yeah, you can type them in if you want to go over it, but this way you just have this clamping turned on. Then we'll grab the bevel amount, let's just call it corners bevel amount. Then I'll plug in the linked corners. Let me just call this bevel. I guess we're using the bevel word everywhere. And then we'll do these as well. By the way, we'll delete the geometry property on the group input, and then we'll create a new panel so we can bring all of these inside. I guess we should have done this first. All right, so would you look at that? We have all of those controls on the modifier panel here laid out all neatly for us. We can add depth. We can control the position of this if we want. We can determine the subdivisions on the bevel and then the bevel amount, but we have to first enable the linked corners. Otherwise, we're going to have to use these ones down here. And by the way, you can't really tell what it is unless you click and drag this out. So I'm thinking the naming convention should be subdivisions first, and then corners bevel, and then amount corners bevel. Because here we also have linked corners bevel. So that makes a bit more sense. And even if this panel is a bit shrinked, you can still tell it's subdivisions first, amount, and then linked corners. All right, now let's go ahead, move this over to the side, click and drag on all of these and hit Control J, which will create a frame. Then if you move over to the node, we can label that frame to base, then increase the label size, enable a color, and we'll do something like an orange, something like that. So now we know that everything that's inside of this panel is related to the base object. Now what we can do is select everything, duplicate it with Shift D, and this one will change the color to something like red, and we'll do base outline. And we go back to the group, and we'll just call this base as well, and then we'll go over here and duplicate the item, and we'll call it base outline. Now we do need to relink all of these values to the newly created one. So you can hold down Control and then just click and drag these down here. This does take some time, but at the very least, we're not having to also recreate the nodes from scratch. So as of now, we have pretty much the same object as before, but I want to go ahead and make some changes. Over here on the curve to mesh node, I want to switch the profile curve and put it into the curve instead. And then for the profile curve, we'll use another quadrilateral, and this will give us sort of this outline. You can see you can set the depth with the height and the thickness with the width. So think of it this way. We have the curve. That's the fillet curve that we generated. That's how it looks like. And then we have the quadrilateral, which is this shape. Let me just draw it right here. And we're having this shape be drawn across the entirety of this curve. And that's what's giving us this shape. Oh my God, I love that you can draw inside of Blender. It's especially useful for tutorials like this when you have to explain some stuff. Now that does mean that the combine XYZ and the curve line, we don't need those anymore. But what we do need is these two values to be plugged into some new values. So right now we have depth, which we'll use for the height. But then we'll click and drag this over here, and that just creates it at the top, but we'll call it thickness. And then we can just drag and drop it on top of the depth inside of the base outline panel. And now just to keep things a bit more clear, we can hit Ctrl-H on a group input, which will hide all the unused properties. You can also hit H to collapse it like that. Another thing I want to do is control the width and height of the shape based on the base itself, because this is the outline for the base. So right now, if we were to go ahead and add a join geometry node over here, and we'll just cut this off, do that, and then plug these two into the join geometry. Now we have both of those shapes showing up. So let me just push the outline on the Z a little bit. Okay, so right now we can control the width and the height for both of these guys separately, right? That's what we want. But what I want to do is make it more convenient. So when I increase the width of the base, the outline width also expands, and then we can decide whether we want to inset it a bit or not. Because this way we're having to increase the width, and then I have to do this. It's a bit annoying, a bit of a hassle. We'll go ahead and hit Ctrl-H to re-show these other values. And we'll grab the height, put it into the height, and the width, put it into the width. These are from the base, remember. So now this is the same. But now in between, we can add a math node. We'll plug it at the top, and we'll do subtract. So what this is doing is it's taking the width value from the base, and in this case, it's subtracting by, let's say, 1. So if the width is 4 on the base minus 1, it's going to be 3 on the base outline. So we have this inset. And then we can duplicate this, put it at the bottom, and we have this. So now look, we can set the width and the height. And then if we want to determine the insetting, we can just go ahead and plug these values over here into the width and then the height as well. But I want to actually go ahead and just rename these to width inset and height inset, which I think makes a bit more sense. So again, we're controlling the width and height of the base together with the outline, and then we're deciding how much we want to inset, which I think makes it a bit more easy to control. So look at that, that's just a lot faster. And then of course, let's go ahead and add some bevel to this. And I would say turn down the thickness and also the depth. Then we can push this back in Z space just a little bit so it's sitting on top. And let me go back to the materials, and we'll just go ahead and rename this to outline. Now let's go over to the emission. We'll crank it up to like 2. Let me switch over to the cycles, and then let's go like a bright blue color. And nothing is happening because remember, we need to change the material on the base outline. and we'll choose the outline. And now we have separate materials on them. All right, so now let's move on to the cutout. I want to be able to cut a hole inside of this base. And just so we can focus on it a bit better, we can cut off the outline from the join geometry. So I want to grab the base ones and then duplicate them, put them down here, call this base cutout. Let's make it maybe green. And by the way, you can just hide these, Control H. Now I'm going to join this into the join geometry. Then I'll also go ahead and duplicate the base panel. We'll call it base cutout. We'll call this width inset just as before and height inset. We want to use the same technique as with the outline. Now we do need to replug these in. Now let me also grab these two subtract nodes at the top. We'll duplicate them, Shift D, Alt P to remove them from that panel, and let's drop them in here. And again, we'll use the width and height of the base and subtract them by the width inset and the height inset, and we'll plug these to the width and the height respectively. Now let me push this into the Z a little bit. So this is the base cutout. Now there is something weird going on. Oh yeah, we're insetting them way too much. I just wanted to show you that they are indeed linked. And now what I want to do is use this object to cut a hole inside of this other object. And first, let's just set the depth of this to be a bit thicker. And then for this guy, we'll do something like that. And then we'll lower the width and height inset. Let's see, we can decrease the width. So this looks more like a card. And then we'll bring it back. Let me just turn on the cavity here, maybe in shadows, just so we can see things a bit better. Bring it inside. And this is going to be pretty much the same as if you use Booleans as modifiers to cut holes or cut a certain object with another object. And now depending on how far in we go, that's how deep the hole is going to be. But now let me go ahead and go over here and we'll do Boolean, mesh Boolean. We'll drop this over here. Then we'll plug the base into the top. And then on the second socket, you can see it's like a longer socket. That means that you can plug in multiple objects. So that's where we plug in the cutter objects is what they're called. And of course, we have to delete this part because we don't want that original base geometry to also be joined on top. And now you can see how a hole is being cut inside by the base cutout. And here we can set the position, so how deep we want it to go. We can either then go all the way and then increase the depth. So now we can have that sort of outline, but I think something like that looks cool. And now let me bring back in the base outline into the join geometry. We'll bring these at the top, maybe reroute them like that. We're going to be moving these panels around all the time. And there we have it. Just one thing is that on the base cutout, we don't actually need the set material node because we're not going to be seeing the cutter. All right, now before I was just cutting this link so it wouldn't show up. But now let's just use a switch node, plug it in here, and we'll just make sure you're using geometry. And now we want to plug this into the true value. So if this is on, then this will output true. If this is off, it will output nothing. Now for the switch, I am going to go ahead and just drag this out, type in group input, which will just create another group input node, same as here, just so we don't have to drag this all the way, just for some clarity. And Control H to hide those. Now if we bring this up, we have a switch property here. We can call this on/off. And then what is this for? This is the base outline, right? So we'll just leave it at the top of the panel. And now we can toggle the visibility of that. And now we can just duplicate this. So we want this to go into the true and the output into the mesh. I'm going to delete that just so I can drag it again. That will automatically create another input on/off. This will be inside of the base cutout. Let's test it real quick. Yeah, we're cutting it off. And then by the way, we can just rename this to toggle visibility, all in caps, and also make it red like that. And we can hover over the color, Control C to copy, go over here, Control V to paste, and we'll also name it toggle visibility. And then we'll duplicate them one more time, plug them into here, plug the output into mesh 1, make some room here. And this time, I guess we could just duplicate this item and bring it over here and just make sure you're using that one as the switch. So now we can even toggle the visibility of the base on and off. Got the cutter and we got the outline. All right, so there's our node set up for the base cutter, and the outline. So that's pretty much the entire process. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and duplicate this, create like a description base with an outline and also like a character base with an outline as well. And we're gonna speed through this process because it is just a repetitive task. So you don't have to sit through and watch me do it step by step. Alright, so I've gone ahead and duplicated these panels, relinked them to new panels over here, created all the necessary properties, and also made a few adjustments to the positioning, the beveling, and the thickness and all that. So now we have this card. And the character window is where we'll be applying the Ray Portal shading when we get to the character creation stage. But one more functionality I want to add to the description and the character outlines is that, see right now, if I move the character, for example, the outline doesn't move with it. Same with the description. For this, we'll use a vector math node. We'll plug it over here and let me unhide this. And what I want is the position of the description, which I believe is right underneath here. So we'll grab the position here, control click and switch it over. So we'll add that with the position of the description outline, which I'll actually rename to position offset. And we do need to make sure that the description outline's position offset is set to 0, so we're not adding anything. Well, I guess we do have to bring it back on the Z a little bit. But see what I mean now? If I go back to the description and move it on the X, they move together. But if I want to add some offset to the position for the outline, I can do that over here. So that's the whole idea. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for the character outline. And let's just test it out. Moving together, can offset it a little bit. Pretty sweet. All right, now let's start adding some text elements. So we'll add a string to curves node. Let me zoom in here. And let's say type in, I don't know, monkey. So we'll start with the description text. We'll bring it over here. In fact, let me just drag these a bit to the top so this can be in between. So the description text sits on top of the description base. And then I can add a frame to this. And let's go increase the size. We'll do description text, make it blue. And for the time being, let's just plug this directly into the group input. And let's type in, I don't know, something happens when you play this card. And there's our text. First off, I want to center this, middle, and then midpoint. And then I want to add a fill curve node. Now we can see our text a bit better. But if we switch to wireframe mode, we can go ahead and use n-gons instead, which will give us a cleaner output. Then we'll add an extrude mesh node. Let me grab these and bring them inside of this panel. And now by tweaking the offset value, we can determine the extrusion. But just make sure you uncheck individual because that will give you some weird results at the bottom here. It's basically extruding each face individually, but we don't want that. Now, as we're looking at the bottom side, we do need to fill that up. So let's just fill in the original with the extruded mesh. We'll hold down Control Shift and then right click and drag, and that will join those two with a join geometry node. But now if we toggle the normals or the face orientation, you can see these are red, which means they are facing in the upward direction. So let's just add a flip faces node to flip those downwards. But now they are still not connected. Let me just demonstrate that real quick by adding a scale elements node. They're scaling down individually. You can see the faces, they're not connected. So we need to merge by distance. That's still not going to do anything because we need to first realize the instances. And now you can see that the bottom faces and everything else are merged together. So let's delete the scale elements node. Finally, we can add a transform geometry to be able to control the position of this and a set material node. And for this, let me just toggle this off, go to the materials, and I'll just duplicate the outline. Then I'll add this, bring this back to outline so I can keep them all visible. And then we'll do text just so I have the same emission. We'll switch over here and then just make sure you're using text. All right, so everything that you see in between here is responsible for the 3D text extrusion. So again, what we can do is hit Ctrl-G to group that. And now we have this neat node group that we can reuse across our geometry nodes. But we'll go back in, and first of all, I just want to drag this offset scale. Let's call it extrusion. And let's also rename this to 3D text extrusion. But before we move on to setting up the group inputs, let me also show you something. So right now, there is no way for us to have 2 rows. And also we're just using the string input over here. So let's delete that and we'll drag the string and let's use a replace string node. Here we can input a string, so something and then something else. But you can see they're both in the same row. Now what I want to do is have the first something be on the first row and then something else on the second row. And what I can do is say in the find, we can input /. So now I can go ahead and after something, I can input /, but that doesn't do anything as of now. But what we want to do is find the / in this string and then replace it with a special character, which is a line break. So now wherever you type in a / in your string input, that's going to be found and then replaced by a line break. So now we can also have a / after the other one. And now we can control where we want to have a row split. But anyway, let's just type in something happens when you play this card. And instead of starting to create the panel over here and all the properties and everything, I'll just go ahead and start dragging these out. Because remember, this will just, if you type in group input, it will create a new one and it'll just put it at the top over here. So I think it's a bit cleaner to do it that way. So let's start with a string. Do group input, and here I can go ahead and do use / for line break. So you can also read here and it'll kind of give you a hint. And by the way, let's copy this and then go down with it still selected. You have this description input. We can paste that there. And this means that whenever you hover over the input property over here, you'll get a description there that says use / for line break. So just in case you want to input some descriptions for your properties. Let me go ahead and create a new panel. We'll call it description text and we'll bring this inside. But I guess I can do that later as well. And I actually take that back because I can't now just drag this into a new input for some reason. I'm just gonna hit Ctrl-H to unhide everything else. And let me just disconnect that. I'll just bring this over so I can start connecting these materials. And the good thing is that it pops it over at the top there. Then we'll do the translation and the size, character spacing, word spacing, and line spacing. Oh, and of course I forgot the extrusion here. And now let me go ahead and just rename this to depth, just to keep the naming convention consistent. Let's just bring this over here. We'll call this position offset, because again, I want this to follow the position of the description and then just add any offset to it if we want to. We can hide those, bring it over here. And as I said before, we want to use vector math to add the description position. So let me just bring it before the description panel, just so it's easier to find things. And I'll add the position of the description with the position of the description text and then just join that into there. So now if we plug this back into the join geometry and then plug this over here, now we can see everything as it was before. And I want to go over to the description text. Let's just start by bringing down the size and then the depth as well, so we can see that a bit better. And then I can offset the Z a little bit. Now just be careful with the depth. If you have it set too high, unless you look at it from up front, you're not gonna really be able to tell what it says. So I just like to keep the depth minimal. And of course, it moves together with the description base. Oh, and I just went ahead and added an on and off switch for the description text, as well as scaled down the description base and moved it down a bit because I want to have some space here for the type text and the name of the character over here, which is what we're going to be doing next. So I'll start duplicating these. All right, so there's the type text. I've added the position offset of this type text to the position of the base because I want it to move with the base. Now let's do the character name. Alright, so there we have the character text, the type text, as well as the description text. As I said before, each of these texts are linked to the position of their corresponding base layers. So the character text is linked to the position of the character base, the type is linked to the base itself, and the description text is linked to the description base. Now let's go ahead and create a couple of cylinders, or number holders, let's call them, where we can put the attack, let's say, and the health points. So up here, let's just add a cylinder, and we can just connect this into the join geometry, and we'll just do that. And let's just create a frame here, which we'll call number 1 holder. Add a color, increase the label size. And we'll start by adding a few more vertices. We'll do 64. Then we'll decrease the radius a bit, decrease the depth as well. I don't know, something like that. Then we can add a transform geometry node after, just to relocate this to the left side. Now I can go back to the character text. Let me just offset it and we'll put it up there. Then we'll do a set material, and let's just use the base. Now I want to add some outline across the cylinder. So I'll just drag the transform geometry and turn this mesh into a curve, and I'll just join those in just so we can see what it looks like. And then I'll do curve to mesh. So this turns back into a mesh. Plug this into the profile curve, and then for the curve, we'll do quadrilateral. But you can see that it's using every single edge, whereas I want to only isolate maybe the top or the bottom side. And we can do that within the cylinder node. So I can take the top selection and plug that into the mesh to curve. So now only that part is being converted to a curve. And now we have this singular line. Let's delete that. That's being turned into a mesh by using the quadrilateral as a profile curve. And now we can tweak the width and the height to determine the thickness and the depth. I will duplicate the transform geometry here and plug it after the curve to mesh. So we can use this to offset the position of the outline. So let's say I want to bring it in a bit, something like that. Let me see. Maybe I can bring this further out. Yeah, by the way, this depth is way too high. And then we can bring it back, slightly push this in so it's kind of roughly sitting in the center of that cylinder. And I could go ahead and just thicken it up a bit. Now for the base, I'm just gonna go ahead and add a set material over here, and I'll use the base, then we'll duplicate it, and for this I'll just use the outline so we have another glow like that. And then I'll go ahead and add a group input node. We'll just bring it at the top here so we can start dragging things in. So we'll start with the base material, then we'll do the outline material. So over here on the modifiers tab, you can see the first one is using the base material, and then the second one is outline material. Then let's drag the radius in. We'll do the position. Then we'll do the vertices, which will be our subdivisions, as well as position over here. And we'll do the depth. I believe this is the outline depth, so that's that. Then we'll do outline thickness, which is the height. Outline depth, outline thickness. And then the outline position offset. And we actually don't need a vector math node over here because the transform geometry node is actually affecting this whole node tree over here as well. And then we're adding the offset position on top. So you can see if I move the position of this, they move together, and then I can just offset the outline as well. So that's convenient for us in this case. We can hide that, bring it inside of this panel. Oops, not that one. The purple one. And let's not forget to duplicate these for the visibility. Unhide this. Let me just grab this. I'll do duplicate item, put it over here, and we'll use that one. And of course, we need to create a panel. We'll call it number 1 holder. Also, we need to make sure this goes over here, and then this goes into this point. So now we can toggle that on and off. Gone ahead and duplicated this, but I think I'll go into the materials and let me just add a new material. We'll do base and then we'll duplicate it. We'll do health. Let's just make the color red. And over here on the modifiers for the number 2 holder, base material, we'll do health. And then we'll add another one. This time we'll choose the outline, we'll duplicate that, we'll do health outline, so we can make this red instead. Go back here, we'll use the health outline, just so we have some variation. And I believe over here in the original version, I also added a different kind of color, so let's add another one. We'll do duplicate attack outline, And for this, we'll just do like, I don't know, kind of like an orange one. And we'll switch that out. They kind of look the same in this case, but you can go back, maybe tweak the hue. Now I'll go ahead and grab the character name. I'll just duplicate that. And this will be number 1 text. I'll just type in 1 or maybe 5, I don't know. Then we can scale it down, go into the front view. Oh, here's the part where we want to control the position of the text based on the number 1 holder's position. So let's re-enable these. And all the way down here, you can see where the position is being taken from for the add vector math node. So I think I just have to switch this, and now we can just shrink down the depth, push this in Z space. Let's just bring it on top like so. Now we got that going on. And by the way, we can switch the material of this to attack outline. All right, so there you go. Now let me go ahead and real quick switch the fonts of these. And by the way, just one thing, I don't know why this is the case, but we can't really have a font go into the group input so we can then access it here and just change it. We just have to go into the geometry nodes itself, click this folder icon, head over to the fonts. And let's say, which one was this? This was the number. It will do Poppins bold. Then we can move over to the number 1 text and choose that font as well. We'll do the same for the type text. And then for the description, I'll just search for Poppins regular. Now this font is a bit smaller in size, so I'll go over to the size of the numbers first, increase that. Then we'll copy it, paste it to the other number. Oh, and I forgot the character name as well. Let's go choose bold, character text, increase the size, move it up a bit. And we got the type text, increase the size, as well as the description text. Okay, now that looks a lot better. But yeah, again, you can't really change the font from the modifiers panel. You're gonna have to dive into this geometry nodes canvas and then find where these are. So in fact, I can just add another panel and rename that to change font here. And now you can tell it apart a bit more. All right, so that's pretty much the entire 3D card done when it comes to the geometry nodes. It's a huge node tree, but as you saw, it's quite a repetitive thing. You can like bunch them up like this. So that's the base with the outline and the cutout. Then you got the description with the text. You got the description outline as well. Okay, that's there. Then we have the type text. Then we have these 3. And then we have these 4 with the number holders and the number text. Then finally, you just join them all together with a join geometry, and that's it. So when you break it down in bite-sized pieces, it kind of makes a lot more sense as opposed to just looking at this as a whole and thinking, oh my God, what is this? How am I going to be able to recreate it? So I think that's a good way to go about when it comes to geometry nodes. Try to break things down in smaller parts. All right, so now I'm in the original project from the 3D card that I made. But the reason I'm here is because I want to show you the shader editor for the portal. So if I focus on that, here we go, here it is. Again, as I said at the beginning, this was only possible because a guy by the name of B2Z3D on Reddit helped me figure it out. And there's a bunch of math going on here with vectors and stuff, which I don't really understand, to be honest with you. But I would say the main part is this value over here. This is controlling where the portal is looking from. So if I zoom out here on the second window, this is where the main scene is, and then this is where the portal room is. It's basically 10 meters down from the original scene. And that's why I input -10 over here. Now, if this were, let's say, where is it? The portal, I'll just bring it down on the Z, I don't know, maybe -15 instead. Now we can't see anything. Maybe if you look down, you can see it down there. Yeah, there it is. But in order to see it properly, we would have to move this down further. Yeah, you can hold down Control and use increments of 1. So now as I'm moving it down, I am correcting for its position. But let's just go back and bring this back into its place. So again, you don't have to understand what any of this is doing. All you need to know is that this is making sure that the position and the rotation of the 3D card will work properly to show you the portal room inside of that face. And by the way, if we go back to the geometry nodes editor, I can go ahead and find the character base over here. I'm using the portal material. which is this one. Now let me go back to the shader one more time, choose the portal, focus those in. This over here is responsible for the position of the portal node, and this is for the rotation. And you can see they're purple, these values, X, Y, Z, and that's because they're being driven with drivers by the position and rotation of the 3D card. Now, if you happen to use some other object, you just make sure you go to the location, right-click, copy as new driver, then go right-click, paste driver. And you want to do that for the XYZ on the location, paste them here, and then XYZ, copy those, paste them here. Now, these two solve the position and rotation issue, because without these drivers, if I go ahead and just delete any of them, they're not going to be working properly. You see, the rotation is broken. The position still works, but not the rotation, so you want to make sure you link those up. But now, what about the scale? Well, if I go ahead and scale it up and down, you can see it works, but in order to fix the scale issue, I had to use some other methods. So if I move over to the portal room here, I have this empty, and this empty is using a copy scale constraint, and it's copying the scale of this card. So that means that when I scale down the card, the empty scales with it. And then I parented everything inside of the portal room to the empty as well, so they scale all together. So that was the workaround for the scale. But then another thing is if I go over to the empty, you can see the Y position is purple, which again indicates that it's being driven by a driver from the position of some other object. In this case, it's the scale of the card. So as I scale this down, you can see the position will change. So as I scale this down, you can see from this side maybe a bit better. Let me hide the room as well. See, the location is changing, because without that, if I go ahead and delete the driver, it would just stay in place and then scale up and down. So if I scale this down, at some point, it's going to start cutting off. And the reason is because what's happening is with the Ray portal node, let me go ahead and hide the portal room. Let's say this is the line where the portal is being driven from, or like it's shooting rays this way. And then it sees whatever it sees, and then that's being projected over here. Well, now just keep watching this line. As I scale this down, the objects keep getting closer. I guess the line is, I see. When does it start cutting off? Yeah, we'll focus on the text. Okay, I guess somewhere here. So we can delete this, and then we'll just draw another line right there. So now as we scale this down, those objects move closer and closer towards the Ray portal line, and then they just end up disappearing. So to counteract that, I added a driver on the location, which is driven again by the scale. I think I just copied one of these. It doesn't matter, because for the most part, these will all be the same. So I'll just go copy as new driver, go back to the empty, paste driver. Now it's going to go crazy. So we have to go ahead and right click, go over to edit driver, or open the driver editor. And here we can set this to linear. We don't need any bending or anything like that. And what this is saying is this is the position, the Y position of the empty, when the scale of the 3D card is set to 0. And this is the position of the empty when the 3D card scale is set to 1. So let's make sure this is set to 1. You can even hit Alt-S to reset the scale. And then we'll find the empty here, and we'll start dragging this down. So when the scale is set to 1, we want the empty to be there. And then as the card scales down, I'll make sure it's very, very small. And then we can focus in on it so we get closer. We'll select the empty once again. We just make sure we push it far enough away so that it doesn't get cut off. Now, if we were, say, put it in the same line as the other one, you can see how it's pretty much gone at that point. But now it's working perfectly, so we can Alt-S, reset the scale. Hopefully that all makes sense to you. All right, now let's quickly take a look. I can go ahead and hide the empty here. Just take a look at the room. What do we have going on here? It's a simple box with a, let me go over here, portal room. We got a checkered texture plugged into a principled BSDF, and we're using the texture coordinate from the object. Then we got some Suzanne text. This is another interesting point. You can see that if I go over to the 3D card, under the character text, nothing is written in there. We can type in Suzanne, but then we're going to get the duplicate copy. So let's hide this. And this is basically the text that's being generated in the geometry nodes editor. If I can find that, this is the character text. But what I wanted to do is have the text be inside of the portal room. So I just deleted this, and then I went ahead and created a simple 3D text with a default text object here in Blender. You can't see it because it got created somewhere up there, but there it is. So what this means is that if you ever want to have some text or anything else sitting inside the portal room or inside the card, then you need to make sure that those objects are literally inside of the portal room. And this just has, I believe, the text glow material, so it's emitting light. And then for the monkey, you can switch to the shader editor. It's a bit of a neat trick here. So here I have two material outputs, so I can switch between them. This one is just using a principal BSDF with these properties and then this color. Whereas this one, it's mixing between two shaders. We have the principal shader and an emission shader, which we can preview if we Control-Shift left click. But then we're mixing this and this one based on a light path node, which is saying is camera ray as the factor. So what this does is basically says to Blender that wherever this object is being seen by the camera, make sure you're showing this guy. But whatever ray is not a direct camera ray, meaning it's gonna shoot out emission rays all over the room, well, in that case, it's gonna use the emission shader. So that's why you see this glowing room, but to us, it still looks like a normal metallic Suzanne. Because otherwise, if we don't use this trick and we just plug the emission directly into the material output, you see we just lose all detail. Sure, we're emitting light all over the place, but we no longer can see the Suzanne monkey. Anyway, we'll cut this off and we'll switch to this material output. By the way, that's a cool little trick. You can plug things in and then just have two material outputs, and whatever you have selected is the active material output node. And then finally, as you can see, I have an infinite backdrop with some lights to create this simple studio setup. If I click shift right click over here, we can add a plane. I'll show you how I did that real quick. So let me move it to the side. I'll go ahead into edit mode, tap 2 to go into edge selection mode. We'll hit E, Z to extrude upwards. And then we'll just add a bevel modifier. And now we can bevel that, increase the segments. And we have this, which we can push backwards a bit. And then I have some lights over here. And I like to hide these UI elements so we can have a clear view. And now we can rotate this around to maybe catch the light a bit better, scale it up and down, move it around. And by the way, I'm using the real-time compositor, which I can disable for a moment just so we can move a bit faster. But I will show you the compositing setup afterwards. Now, another thing, as I was playing around with the portal room design, is if you go into edit mode with this, select that face in the back, and then just push it all the way over in the Y space until basically it goes off into the distance where you don't have any more light. You get this really trippy effect. But yeah, anything you want to add to the portal or like the character window, that thing you want to do over here on this portal room, which is 10 meters downwards. And remember, again, this is the portal shading setup. Just make sure this value is set properly. You can even have the portal room be 30 meters to the right side, but the main thing is to keep it far enough away from the main scene so it doesn't interfere with the objects or the lights. Let me just show you another cool little trick with the lights before we move on to the compositor. So if I select the backside light here and then go down under the object properties, there's this light linking option under shading, and you can see I have this light linking collection called backlight, and I've essentially just dragged the ground into it and then disabled it. So light linking basically means you can have control over what your lights affect or don't affect. So I brought in the ground object and just toggled it off. So that's just saying, you know what, affect anything else, but not the ground. So now I can just have some backlights on the card and everything and not have to worry about polluting the ground material with any lighting. I think it's the same. No, actually this one does affect the ground because I want to also cast some shadows on it. All right, so let me just set up an angle here for the 3D card, and we'll go ahead and hit render image. And once it's done rendering, it will process through the compositing nodes and give you the final output. Now, if we go over to the compositing, because we rendered an image, you get to see it now here. And the only thing I did was add a glare node, and you can actually see what the glare node does. Even if you go back to the main scene here, under this panel, you can choose to enable the compositor and have it show up in the camera. Now, this does kind of slow things down sometimes, depending on what nodes you use, and also certain nodes are supported and certain other ones are not, so keep that in mind. And you can have this be only visible through the camera, so right now we're not seeing any glow on the 3D card if we look at it from any other view, or you can just choose to always see it, but we can choose to only see it from the camera view, which will not show up anywhere else. Alright guys, so that was all for this tutorial. Hopefully you were able to learn something new and have some fun while doing so. If you end up creating anything based on this tutorial, then please tag me in case you share it online. I love seeing what you guys come up with. Again, if you want to skip rebuilding it yourself, then you can grab the template on my Gumroad page for just a few bucks, which is also a great way to help support the channel. Thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.